everybody. Welcome to this sadly last session of our Spring Seminar 2023 of the Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy Initiative. Delighted to have here Katarina Peixoto, who is currently at the Universidade de São Paulo. Is that the right one? Finally. Because she's been wrestling with so many appointments in the last couple of years, I've lost track. Was formerly at the University of Buenos Aires, which I think is also where you are currently geographically located. And today she will be talking to us one of my favorite pieces of early modern philosophy, which is the dialogue between Elisabeth of Bohemia and Rene Descartes. And her title is Beyond the Reality Principle, a further step into a philosophical dialogue between Elisabeth of Bohemia and Rene Descartes. And so with that, I'm going to now share the screen. Here we go. Everybody seeing this? Oh, no. Or is yours, Katarina? I'm gonna be your clicker.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna ready. So thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here. It's an honor, and Emmanuel is a great interlocutor, and so I'm very happy to be here. Right now, in fact, I am in Buenos Aires, and I'm very glad and a bit terrified to talk about this. This is a work in progress, of course, and this is a sort of bet, and I'd like to present it here, and I'm a bit afraid, so let's go. Beyond the reality principle, a further step into a philosophical dialogue between Elisabeth and Descartes. This proposal aims to take seriously the call to think about the philosophical legacy of women, as Eileen O'Neill suggests in her seminal work, Disappearing Ink of 1997. It deals with our knowledge of philosophy's internal history in the approach of philosophers silenced by the historiography. This is a proposal to revisit O'Neill's masterful work on Cartesian metaphysics, mind-body interaction and metaphysical consistence, a defense of Descartes of 1987. And to seek from the very proposed reconstruction, the way Elisabeth of Bohemia seems to have had thought about action as freedom. In her defense of Cartesian consistence with respect to the mind and body interaction, O'Neill resorts to the asymmetry between mind and body in order to ensure the consistency of the interaction with the Cartesian general theory of causality, mostly as a reply to Foucher's accusations of inconsistency in what he understood Cartesian substantial dualism was. More than a quarrel over the locus of final causality, O'Neill's diagnosis calls attention to what she calls the reality principle, namely that, I quote, there must be at least as much reality in the total efficient causal things as there exists in the effect. End quotation. Then, from the asymmetry between thought and extension follows the intelligibility of relations and properties included that have not yet reality yet, except in the mind, as it seems to be the case of voluntary actions for Elisabeth. By assuming the asymmetry between mind and body, as O'Neill detects as a Cartesian step, mostly in the discourse, it is possible to revisit the correspondence and find a practical philosopher, the princess, aligned with the project of the meditations. It is about shedding light on a rationalist horizon of prudence in charge of a subjective structure of the first order as a possible theory of freedom to be reconstructed. This work is part of my research on action freedom in Elisabeth of Bohemia at the Philosophy Department of the University of São Paulo with support from the FAPESP. The project aims to suggest a reconstruction of a theory of action from the text that seems to have guided Elisabeth's questions in a privileged way, Descartes' metaphysical meditations. That is to say that the work is internal and intends to be part of the cottage industry of the early modern rationalism. That is a methodological choice in the whole research I'm trying to set the stage of the art here. It is about to offer an interpretation in which the relationship between substantial interaction and ethics is consistent, not only in the Cartesian project as presented in the Passions of the Soul mostly, but in retrospect, from Elisabeth's thought. Perhaps the non-Franciscan aspect of the above summary only aims to make it clear that the connection between mind and body is not problematic as such for Descartes, but poses challenges for Cartesian philosophy and methodological commitments, because it questions not only the relations between mind and body, but the implications of it with respect to the interplay of mind and world more generally. Accounting for the connection between one relationship and another is therefore a task that is not trivial and that has not yet a meteor scholarship in order to grasp easily what both Descartes and especially Elisabeth were exactly talking about, mostly in the beginning of the epistolary exchange. As far as the princess is concerned, above all, the task of philosophically articulating her thought is imposed in order to deal with the text in stems from the philosophical document addressed by her to Descartes, which inaugurated a fruitful and long-lasting correspondence for more than 6 years, Passions of the Soul. More than tracing a conceptual origin, what is at stake is to seek the conceptual and programmatic connection that underpins the Cartesian ethical theory. The intent is to establish an internal perspective that in turn will highlight the real Franciscan reach that the broad summary does not reveal. Is there a practical quest informing the substantial dualism? For Elisabeth, of course. That's my quest. In case of a positive answer, is there and what would be Elisabeth's contribution to the treatment of this relationship between mind and body? I am not convinced that Descartes, in committing herself to substantial dualism, was somewhat guided or even dismayed by the nature of moral actions, even less in a social context. Whereas for Elisabeth, in my view, this is the fundamental issue. Identifying a structure in this document, namely the epistolary exchange, seems to be at the service of turning intelligible how the ontological problem can be articulated with the practical problem from the perspective of the philosopher Elisabeth. First, I'll seek to justify that the document has a structure, and then following the footsteps of O'Neill in her interpretation of causality in Cartesian metaphysics, I intend to shed light on the distinction between the reality principle characteristic of efficient causality relations at the level of properties and substance and modes, and the notion of imminent causality. In the reconstruction suggested by O'Neill, we'll see one can find her take on the scope of imminent reality, a way to carry out a metaphysical inquiry into morality consistent with a theory of freedom. After unveiling the structure of the document, the further step consists in addressing a possible interpretation of the way in which Elisabeth considered the mind and the body relationship from her first letter addressed to Descartes and his first reply. Now, point one, searching Geistgeschichte of the correspondence. Eileen O'Neill uses in her classical Disappearing Ink a quasi-Hegelian concept of Geistgeschichte as a further task in the recovery of women philosophers neglected by the canon. She eventually advocates for a new historiography where the search for an internal history is possible. That is to say, a conceptual scholarship on a philosophical thought founded in precarious documentation and few when some literature about it may be done, is done. According to O'Neill's model, inspired albeit discreetly in the Hegelian concept of history of philosophy, the internal history of philosophy would include stages of a conceptual and dialogical exploration, through which the inclusion of women silenced by the historiography could be performed with programmatic tenacity. Thus, the critical narrative of philosophical practice would receive not only more information, but also more reflection in order to strengthen a culture of skepticism. The correspondence between Elisabeth and Descartes is by many criteria a good case in point on the challenges of O'Neill's methodological strategy with respect to the very notion of internal history of the women philosophers. As Ebersmeyer points out, the correspondence has long been neglected, in part because of the partial use of the letters, since the discovery of the whole, or almost due to some lost letters, epistolary exchange in Fouché de Carrel, editorial work in 1879. Descartes' letters to Elisabeth appeared in Cléselier edition in 1657, 31 letters from Carrel's work to now, a plethora. From Carrel's work to now, however, a plethora of scholarship was built on what Descartes had said to the princess, a historiographical practice according to which Elisabeth is quite well known as a name and not as a philosopher. O'Neill's, Lily Allen's, Lisa Shapiro, and Sabrina Ebersmeyer's research started the work of epistemic justice required to restore the dialogue as such, and not a soliloquy, and the implications of a soliloquy's perspective, including for the Cartesian scholarship. The search for a structure by means of a dialogical dynamics in the correspondence follows the recognition that in the first place there was a dialogue. And by considering how and if the correspondence between Elisabeth and Descartes can be interpreted, and what are the implications of proceeding in this way, we may find a real philosophical dialogue. The nowadays expanding in scholarship considers Elisabeth's long-lasting epistolary exchange with Descartes mostly in a thematical way, and with the exception above mentioned, the dialogue is asymmetrically considered. So the emphasis on the distinction between mind and body, introduced as an ontological problem by Descartes, may overlook not only Elisabeth's perspective, but her philosophical legacy to the Geistgeschichte of the early modern philosophy. The first step I am suggesting here is that one, there is a dialogue dynamics that leads Elisabeth to develop a philosophical position, both of her own and current with the discussions of method brought about Descartes. And two, by recognizing these dynamics, one can, in retrospect, discover and identify not just an ontological quarrel about mind and body, but a theory of action to be reconstructed, and therefore a theory of freedom in the Cartesian project. This second step will be only pointed out at best here. The correspondence was initiated by Elisabeth, who wrote a letter in May 6, 1643, where she asks, I quote, "I ask you, please to tell me how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions. For it seems that I went quotation because the most important part was already read. End quotation. That is a complex question and also a methodological deserving, and also a methodological one deserving an analysis. To be fair, therein lies, as I read it, the seeds for what is developed of the dialogue with Descartes. But it is not clear that Descartes has got it like that. So in his letter to Elisabeth, his first letter to her, he said, I quote, "There are two things about the human soul on which all the knowledge we can have of its nature depends. One of which is that it thinks, and the other is that being united to the body, it can act and be acted upon it. I have said almost nothing about the latter and have concentrated solely on making the first better understood, as my principal aim was to prove the distinction between the soul and the body. I will try here to explain the manner in which I conceive of the union of the soul and the body, and how the soul has the power to force to move it." End quotation. Of course, this is the Lisa Shapiro edition and translation that I'm using here. I have emphasized both the passages because there is, as I read it, a difference between what she asks and what he replies. That is important for a due reading of the epistolary exchange. But first, let's establish the structure of the exchange. The first two letters set the dynamics of what I'm taking as the first part of the correspondence, which goes from May 1643 to May 1645, when Descartes writes her telling he is extremely surprised to learn that the princess had been ill for a long time. To that letter, Elisabeth replies with a remark on her supposed weakness of my sex. This is what she said to Descartes, which would entail some problems to her soul. Of course, other things are said, but the awareness or recognition of her health condition seemed to operate a turn in the dialogue. And to be fair enough, a direct dialogue is in fact initiated from then on. Because after that, Descartes stops talking about his way of dealing with causality and its implications for his ontological commitment. It begins to address to a friend in order to help her cope with her sadness. The dialogue becomes a kind of advice and a search for help for the princess. And this is how Descartes ends up resorting to a joint reading of Seneca's Da Vida Beata in August 45. Then a philosophical exchange takes place in its proper sense. Descartes resorts to Seneca, correcting the neo-Stoic conception for which the sovereign good would be heterogeneous to us, as some fate or fortune, which, as Descartes puts it, I quote, depends only on those things that are external to us. So those to whom good comes without their having done anything to try to attain it are deemed more fortunate, plus heureux, than such. On the other hand, true happiness consists, it seems to me, in a perfect contentment of the mind and an internal satisfaction that those who acquire without fortune's favor. Thus, to live beat, to live happily, is nothing but to have a mind that is perfectly content and satisfied. End quotation. However, and here are the most important remark, making the sovereign good self-related entails a whole set of related and somehow new or unknown properties and difficulties. That is what Descartes considers by stating, I quote, considering after this what quod beatam vitam efficiat means, that is to say, what those things which can give us the sovereign contentment, I note that there are two sorts of them. Those which depend on us, such as virtue and wisdom, and those which do not depend on us at all, such as honors, riches, and health. End quotation. By taking the sovereign good as somehow homogeneous with those who seek it, Descartes seems to assume a position for which facing the fog, because the fog is the quotation as Professor Shapiro translates is, I quote, all men want to live happily, but as to see clearly what brings about a happy life, they are in a fog. A happy life, they are in a fog, end quotation. Would require a kind of clarity established according to a distinction with respect to what depends and what does not depend on us. Everything happens, therefore, as if happiness and action and freedom were self-related and therefore had a therapeutic effect when obtained according to what can only depend on us. The task of being happy would be a kind of internal job only. This is how Descartes resorts to his provisional moral code he had established in the third part of the discourse with three of its rules. First, rule 1, always try to make, I quote Descartes, always try to make of his mind as well as he can in order to know what must be done or not done in all the events of life. 2, have a firm and constant resolution to execute all that reason advises him to do, without having the passions or appetites turn him away from it. 3, while he so conducts himself as much as he can in accordance with reason, he keeps in mind that all the goods he does not possess are each and every one of them entirely outside of his power. From this letter until September 1645, there is a change that only develops as a philosophical dialogue as such. But after asking Descartes to correct Seneca, Elisabeth goes ahead and offers a possible way out of the dualism, if I may put in this way, between what Descartes had seemed to have taken as dependence and non-dependence. It is in this letter that she introduces her perspective on passions. And it is in this letter that her perspective appears, as I read it, developed and consistent with what seems to have been presented from the beginning of the epistolary exchange. The dialogical dynamics, therefore, presents itself in the change of level of discussion, both in terms of the positions of the interlocutors and the content of what was discussed. As for the positions, Descartes' position as Elisabeth's position as a student, I said Descartes, Elisabeth, position as a student, which would have contributed to the silence and the erasure of Elisabeth's philosophical reach through the scholarship, disappeared progressively. Instead of being a student, and once Descartes recognized her perspective on the search for clarification in the Cartesian project, Elisabeth becomes a philosophical interlocutor in proper sense. And as her thoughts develop in turn, Descartes is led to reconsider the implications of his method, that until then seemed not worthy of further reflection. If this makes sense, therefore, if the question posed by Alan in 2004, in one of the seminal works on the correspondence regarding if there was a really philosophical nature on this dialogue, the recognition of a dialogical dynamics can also make sense. So it would follow 3 temporal stages. The first is from May 14.3 to May 45. The second from May 1645 to September 1645, and the third one from September 1645 to Passions of the Soul. So far, so good. Now, are we allowed to affirm that we found an internal history of the correspondence when on designating these stages from the identification of a dialogue dynamic? Yes and no. Yes, because we can already identify a conceptual material robust enough to deserve a scholarship. And no, because we are still a long way from the work that this correspondence deserves to dignify not only Elisabeth, but Descartes' thought as well. From this first stage, however, we can take the next step to what seems to be the birthplace of a possible internal history of and from this correspondence. It is about revisiting Elisabeth's first letter and Descartes' first reply to her. Here, I will once again follow in the footsteps of Eileen O'Neill. This time in an essay, I quote mind-body interaction and metaphysical consistency, a defense of Descartes, in which she offers a possible response to Fouché's famous accusations of inconsistency in the treatment of relationship between mind and body in Cartesian metaphysics that would have fed post-Cartesian philosophy through the 17th and 18th centuries. The problem, because there is a problematic horizon for the reality principle. This is what I will try to approach now. The scholarship has not established yet what Elisabeth may understood, if she understood the argument from the real distinction in the sixth meditation, or more broadly, the interaction between mind and body, and how she has done that. The same can be said about Descartes, what Descartes meant in the argument from the real distinction, and so in the replies to Elisabeth, and of course over in a lot of other places elsewhere. The problem is not recent in the literature, and as O'Neill documents, dates back 1675, when the skeptic Simon Fouché published Critique de la recherche de la vérité, où l'on examine en même temps une partie des principes de M. Descartes. As O'Neill puts it, Descartes would have presented three claims which would be not consistent. Claim 1, mind and body causally interact. Claim 2, mind and body are essentially different substances. Claim 3, there must be essential likeness between a cause and its effect. The issues regarding a super substance or two things dealing with the interactions are beyond my concern here. First, because substance is not trivially a thing, and second, because Descartes was not a mentalist. That is to say that we continue here, hopefully, in the cottage industry. So much so that the problem is, of course, the veracity or reality, or even what is this claim 3 doing there in Fouché's accusation. According to O'Neill, it is possible to provide an interpretation of 1 and 2 consistent to Cartesian conception of causality. The question is, therefore, what are we taking as causality, and how shall we take it in Cartesianism? Only then we may see again, at least to the first reply Descartes gave to Elisabeth's first letter, a somewhat different answer from what she had asked. By doing that, however, we shall not take ourselves as allowed to say that Elisabeth has a different treatment of substantial dualism, or even further, a critique against it. I'm sorry, a critique against it. If O'Neill's readings of the theory of causality is correct, as I think it is, then there are some distinctions to be recognized. The problem is then, in the first place, if Descartes has defended 3 at all. That is to say, if 3 would be a consequence of the reality principle. This is the principle. I quote what is reality principle about. I'm quoting O'Neill now. This is the principle that whatever reality or perfection exists formally in a thing, has or shows, or objectively in an idea, must be contained formally or eminently in its total efficient cause, end quotation. As Janet Broughton says, mentioned by O'Neill, this principle would be, I quote, simply a consequence of the unrestricted adequacy principle. A cause must contain formally or eminently everything that comes about its effect, end quotation. As we will see below, that's the true beginning of our problems. The likeness, as formulated by Fouché, is not so much whether this claim was made by Descartes, but what, if any, Descartes could have meant about the way in which 1 and 2 can make sense. And going further, it is about knowing how, for Elisabeth, the statements 1 and 2 can be or could be reconstructed. Tracing the passages in which Descartes may have stated 3, therefore, at least for now, will be left out, as well as any interpretations that corroborate this reading. What Eileen O'Neill calls the reality principle is this, I quote, there must be at least as much reality in the total efficient cause of things as there exists in the effect, and there must be at least as much reality in the total efficient cause of an idea as there exists objectively in that idea. I shall call this principle the reality principle, end quotation. In order to make sense of the philosophical picture in which there is no final call whatsoever, Descartes provides an ontological landscape with different internal causal change. First, there is God, the infinite substance, which contains the most reality and perfection, then the finite substance and modes. God is independent, and the substance and modes have different levels of dependence bonds due to their imperfect nature. In this hierarchy, there is God, finite substance and modes, and the way causality transits from God to substance and from that ones between each other, and modes are object of dispute in the literature. The nature of the continuous creations, or the doctrine of the continuous creations of God, of the finite substance, is object of some controversy that shall not inform where the problem of the claim 3 is about. That is to say, the nature of the causal change or of the relations among finite substance and modes. In other words, we are in the sublunary world. In other words, the problem stands on the way the dependent beings relate to each other. By dependent, Descartes means imperfect or lacking of reality from the bottom, the modes, up to the finite substance, thought and extension. Mostly Descartes does that in the discourse for a 4th part. According to O'Neill, however, these connections among finite beings would be presented as a whole range of properties, I'm quoting her, which Descartes calls the containment principle. This principle would make the relationships between finite substance and modes intelligible not as mere instantiations in an efficient chain of causality of the reality principle, but as ranges of properties determined according to relations of dependence between levels of realities and perfections, between finite substance and and between finite substance and modes. As O'Neill observes, I quote, the containment principle requires that a cause possess, in some sense, everything that comes to exist in the effect, end quotation. Then there will be some relevant difference between the reality principle and the containment principle. That difference would be intelligible by determining Descartes' use of scholastic terms. I'm following O'Neill's here. The terms are causa secundum fieri, that is to say, causes in respect to coming into being, and causa secundum esse, or cause with respect to existence. In the intervening of the properties of finite substances and modes, the reality principle could explain efficient causality between finite beings, states the commentator O'Neill. The question is this distinction between causes of becoming and causes of existence if this distinction informs the distinction between reality principle and containment principle sufficiently, how useful is it for understanding what Elisabeth thinks of the relationship between mind and body? Let's start with O'Neill's suggested reconstruction of the containment principle. First, she says, reality and perfections are properties. Second, Descartes has not an unambiguous way of objective existence to understand objective existence. He would have at least three concepts of objectivity, according to O'Neill. Three, if we take just objectivity in a deflationary way, maybe some elementary way, just as what is presented to the mind, we can address the main difficulty, which is for the precise meaning of formal containment and eminent containment. She then suggests, she's discussing with some other commentator, but I'm just picking up the reconstruction by O'Neill. The reconstruction is this analysis, I quote, the property phi of any degrees is formally contained in X, if and only if X contains at least any degrees of phi. The property phi is eminently contained in X, if and only if phi is not formally contained in X. X is an entity displaying a greater degree of reality independence than any possible epsilon, which would contain phi formally. Is higher, no, that is to say, it's higher up the ontological hierarchy than any such epsilon. And X has the power to bring about the existence of phi. End quotation. O'Neill's point after discussion with the literature is that one, Descartes did not hold the claim tree with respect to likeness, and that the treatment of psychophysical interaction is far from being established following the causality part of Cartesian program. She then left us this promise, I quote, on a future occasion, I hope to show that matter formally contains and the mind eminently contains all that is objectively in our clear and distinct ideas of extensions, figure, and motion. Matter and the mind eminently contain what exists objectively in sensations, and the mind eminently contains voluntary motion, end quotation. What I have tried to present here is an outline for a reconstruction in which the principle of containment can consistently be identified from the first question Elisabeth posed to Descartes in May 1643. If we recognize a dialogical dynamics, this statement gains even more strength, as the princess does not abandon, but rather refines her search for a more precise definition of the soul. The distinction between principles of causality, the principle of reality, and the principle of containment mentioned above in O'Neill's steps seems, moreover, to be present in the correspondence at the beginning. There is much to be done, and certainly Elisabeth's perspective matters with respect precisely to the fact that for her, the Cartesian theory of ideas is not prima facie playing a central role. But in Elisabeth's first letter to Descartes and in Descartes' first reply to Elisabeth, there is a clue, it seems. Elisabeth asks, I quote, I ask you please to tell me how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions. And then Descartes replies, I will try to explain the manner in which I conceive of the union of the soul with the body and how the soul has the power to move it, end quotation. Does this difference deserve a further step into the reality or containment principle? I believe so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina. Now, as it is our tradition, I will stop the recording so that people can more freely express themselves in the Q&A. But before that, I'm going to also celebrate the end of the official part of VAMP 2023 and thank all of our speakers and all of you for participating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.